Every now and again, I'll think about all of the things that had to fall right into place for Molly and I to get together and to get married. We met at Western Carolina at the Wesley Foundation, the United Methodist Campus Ministry there. So first, Molly, originally being from Florida, would have had a reason to look for schools in North Carolina. Well, the reason was her dad had found a job up here, so that would have had to have happened. Then I would had to have not been accepted to my first school of choice, UNC Chapel Hill. Yeah, I wasn't sure what I was thinking. On top of that, I would have had to have been accepted into my backup school and applied to no other backup schools, my backup being Western Carolina. Then on top of all that, when Western dropped my major, I had to choose to stay there and finish out a new degree rather than transfer. But I decided to stay for particular reasons, that I had grown close with many folks in the marching band and in the Wesley Foundation. So those relationships would have had to have been strong enough and significant enough, important enough to keep me there at Western. And then, of course, Molly would have to have joined the Wesley Foundation as well. Both of us, having been a part of the Wesley Foundation, probably would have had to have been raised Methodists, as we were. Just so many different things that had to just fall right into place for us to wind up together. Looking back on it, it's just so obvious that God had his hand in everything. But of course, when we are right in the middle of it, when we are right in the moment, we have greater difficulty discerning or recognizing God's movement in events, when we're right in the middle of it. Sometimes we assign different causes for those events. Sometimes if those events are not really bad or not really good, sometimes we don't even notice the events themselves, the things in which God is working. Sometimes you might even hear us use that word lucky. When it came to getting to know Molly and eventually seeing her walk down that aisle, you better believe I was using that word in my mind, that thinking about how lucky I was. But was it luck? Is that the best way of thinking about it? Maybe you've heard the one about Jim. Jim was nearly 40 years old and had not yet married. One day, a friend of Jim's asked him, "Hey, have you just not found the right person yet? Are you just not planning maybe on getting married?" And Jim said, "No, I would love to get married, and in fact, I've been with dated several women that I could have seen myself with in the long term. It's just the problem is my mom doesn't really care much for any of the women that I've brought home." So Jim's friend came up with this idea. He said, "How about you go and you find a woman that resembles your mom, and then your mom will see a little bit of herself in her and could not help but to like her." Jim figured he'd tried just about everything now, and what was there to lose? Plus, he was only getting older, so he did like his friend suggested, and eventually he did find a woman that was just like his mom in every way, looked like her, talked like her, had all the same mannerisms and quirks, even had the same laugh as his mom. One day, Jim ran back into his friend, and his friend asked, how are things going? Have you found a woman yet? And sort of with a long face, Jim said, "Yes, I have." Jim's friend said, "Well, does your mom like her?" And Jim said, "Yeah, my mom loves her." And Jim's friend said, "Well, then what's the problem then?" And that's when Jim said, "Well, it's just my dad can't stand her." Now, I share that joke for a particular reason, because you see, I ran across that joke the week before last, when I had absolutely no reason at that time to suspect that God had any hand in letting that joke come across my desktop or wherever I saw it. I had no reason to believe that God was had any hand at all in that joke coming across me in some way. And that joke is just a joke. Not a significant life event in any way. I read the joke, I chuckled a little bit, and life went on. That until this past week, as I was preparing for this Sunday, and when I came across the lectionary passage for this week in Genesis 24. It's the time when Abraham's servant goes out to try to find a wife for Isaac. Now, so was finding that joke, was that just luck? Was that just coincidence? I'm willing to bet that Abraham's servant would probably say no, that it was not a coincidence. If you've ever read the story before, and I invite you to sort of follow along as we recap it together in Genesis 24, then you remember that Abraham tells his servant to go out and search for a wife for his son Isaac. And he tells him to go to the land of that he came from, that Abraham came from. And so the servant goes out, and he comes to the city around the time that the women are drawing water at the well, and the servant has a prayer. He prays to God, and he says, "Let the woman who I ask a drink of water from, and who also gives me a drink of water for my camels, let her be the one that you have given to Isaac to be married." And no sooner than he prays that prayer, this stunningly beautiful woman comes out to get some water, and it's Rebecca. And so, the servant runs to meet her and asks her for a drink of water. She gives him a drink of water. She says, "Certainly, here, have a drink." And then she starts to give water to the camels. And so this prompts the servant to lavish her with gifts and to ask a little bit more about her. Whose daughter are you? Does your father have room for us to stay tonight? And Rebecca says, I'm the daughter of Bethuel, and there's plenty of room for you to stay tonight. And then the verse that I want us to pay attention to is right there. It's verse 27. We sort of just recapped the story up to this point, but I want to focus in on verse 22. This is what the servant says after all of these things have just seemingly fallen right into place, and just how God has been so good in the midst of this. He says, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his loving kindness and his truth toward my master. As for me, the Lord has guided me in the way to the house of my master's brothers." Because sort of hang on to that response from the servant. Then the passage goes on to talk about Rebekah's brother named Laban, who invites the servant in. He takes care of him, offers him a meal. But first the servant says, "I'm not going to eat a bite until I tell you all about this awesome thing that happened with Rebekah." The servant tells them, Laban and Rebekah's dad, everything that happened, and they realize this was totally from God. So they give Rebekah to be married. And then there's this little scene at the end. It doesn't quite end there. They tell the servant to let Rebekah stay a little bit longer. Stay, I think, 10 more days. But the servant just says, "Oh, please don't make me wait. God He's worked everything out so well. I'm excited to get back to my master." And so they do end up letting Rebekah decide whether it's time to go or not. She says it is time to head out. And so the servant returns with Rebekah. He tells Isaac everything that happened, and Isaac takes Rebekah as his wife, and it says there that he loved her. Now, even though Abraham initiated all of that, and the whole point of the story seems to be Rebekah and Isaac getting together, I can't not help but to think that the real purpose of the story as a unit is to tell us something about this servant, to tell us about the perspective of faith that he had. The things that happened, they're just day-to-day events. There's no miracle or boom from the sky. Rebekah doesn't fall down out of a cloud. We're talking about getting some water, having a conversation. He doesn't fully understand the blessing until it unfolds a bit. After being able to look back on all of these sort of seemingly normal day-to-day events. One person has put it this way: with subsequent reflection, we can discern the amazing movement of God in events. Maybe in events like watering some camels, seemingly insignificant. Maybe in an event like winding up at the same college as your future spouse, or even something as seemingly insignificant as coming across a silly joke about a man in search of a wife. But here's what stands out to me about this servant. The servant is able to look back and see God's hand in all of these events because of a perspective of faith that he has had from the very beginning. At the beginning of the journey, he understands that he's being led. He prays at the beginning of the journey for things to happen according to God's promise and faithfulness. He can't quite see the full destination yet, but he knows that any good fortune is going to be the result of not his effort or luck, but because of blessing. The servant trusts the outcome of any event, that it is a result of God's faithful and benevolent decisions and nothing else. So, to those who experience unfortunate events, or even fortunate events, to those of us who experience just neutral events, those things that we haven't given much thought to at all, just because, well, they didn't seem significant to us at the time. The message is for us to look to God and to trust God in all events. That's what it looks like to have a perspective of faith. It's not about minimizing our risks or making only informed decisions, hedging our bets, expecting only the worst or only the best. It's about trusting God to carry us through all events. In Matthew, right before Jesus says, "Come to me," because his burden is easy, he says, "I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from wise and intelligent persons and have revealed them to infants. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. All things have been handed over to me by my Father." So Jesus recognizes God's gracious faithfulness. Jesus, just like Abraham's servant, notices how God has not forsaken his loving kindness and his truth toward us. And Jesus says this, all things have been handed over to me by my Father, even while knowing at the same time that he himself is about to be handed over to the authorities to be crucified for you and for me for the forgiveness of sins. One time, Michigan State was playing UCLA in football. The score was tied to 14, only seconds left to play. The coach sent in the place kicker, David Kaiser, who booted a field goal in to win the game. And when the kicker returned to the bench, the coach said, "Nice going, but you didn't even watch the ball after you kicked it." "That's right," Kaiser said. "I was watching the referee to see how he would signal it, because I have forgotten my contact lenses and I couldn't see the goalposts." See, just like Kaiser could not see the goalposts, we too can't always see the goal, the end, the result, the outcome. But we can have a perspective of faith along the way. We can trust in God's decisions. We can know even before we experience any event in our lives that God is moving, because we can look to Christ and the decision that he has already made, a decision rooted in mercy and in loving kindness. Amen.